Morning, everybody. This is Lou Huger, tuning in this morning from the University of Idaho. I'm an associate educator with the University of Idaho Extension Office, focusing completely on commercial produce safety here in the state of Idaho. So today we're going to be talking about sanitation on the farm, sanitation basics as it relates to the produce safety rule of the Food Safety Modernization Act. This is the second webinar in our April FSMA Produce Safety Rule series. So we have one more next Monday, which will focus on records, but today we're going to be talking about sanitation specifically. So just a couple things that I wanted to touch base on regarding webinars working from home for some of us or watching this from home. There are a couple of things that can help your webinar be more successful and a better viewing opportunity just based on your Wi-Fi. So here are a couple of tips that can help you have this move more smoothly and quicker. A couple of things. So first of all, if you close other programs that may be running on your computer, that really helps just give your bandwidth the ability to focus on the webinar specifically. If you start having issues with clarity, things downloading or getting glitchy, or you can't hear us, you can go ahead and call in. I sent an email to everybody with the call-in number, so that might help. You'll miss out on some of the graphics, but at least you'll be able to stay up with us. If you have any questions, you can go ahead and type those into the chat box, and then we're going to have a Q&A session here at the end, and we can focus on some of those questions and hopefully get them answered. I have some handouts that are also on your pop-out control panel. I'll go through what a couple of those are, but those will be able to be downloaded at whatever point. And I'll also have them posted on our website if you're tuning in later and watching this as a recording. I also wanted to make a note that this webinar and the Q&A session will be focusing only on the produce safety rule, FSMA Produce Safety Rule. So we'll be talking about things that are relevant to that rule, and we won't be talking at all about COVID-related issues. So if you're tuning in for COVID-19 information, just know that we do have resources for that. And if you reach out to me, I can provide those for you, but they're not made through myself or the produce safety team at the University of Idaho Extension. They're made through other extension entities. So last week I had a couple of questions regarding or comments in the polls or surveys at the end of the survey, or sorry, at the end of the webinar, regarding questions that people still had about the produce safety rule. And one of the things that I was getting a lot was that people weren't quite sure what it meant or how it affected them or why this was important. So I just want to reiterate that this webinar series will be focusing a little bit more on the nitty-gritty details of the way the inspections, or I guess what inspectors will be looking for in an inspection, and less so about the basics of the produce safety rule. So if you do want more of that information, we do have a lot of that on our website, and we have a lot of those resources created. So I just wanted to provide a couple snapshots of our produce safety website, as well as here are some links that I have attached in the handouts as well. So we have a couple resources about trying to decipher how the rule affects you. We have a bunch of training videos on our website, which are highlighted on here as well. And these are just a bunch of different resources that could be useful to you, but specific to this webinar today, I just highlighted some of the training videos and our website as a general resource. And then towards the bottom, another thing that I wanted to bring up is that the Produce Safety Alliance has launched some new classes on their website, which are going to be available during the COVID-19 time period, I guess, which are going to be offered remotely. And I reached out to one of their representatives today with some questions, and so they are going to be available to anybody in our state to take regardless of where they're located, as long as they're open to the public, which is indicated on their website. So that would be just like a regular class that we teach in Idaho, which fulfills the produce safety rule requirement for training. And it'll just be like a live Zoom class, just like the 8-hour ones that we teach. So that's going to be a really great resource for anybody that's needing the training but won't be able to make it due to travel restrictions or just general safety restrictions. So yeah, all these links are available in the handout section of your page that you're looking at right now. So I just wanted to touch base on this again, just in case there are individuals tuning in today that didn't watch our series last week, just because I don't want to go into this in too much depth because the first webinar last week talked more about this, but these are just some general compliance dates and inspection dates that are relevant to the produce safety rule. If you want more information on this, you can tune back into the recorded webinar from last week, but I just wanted to show it as a general reference in terms of giving context to this series. So last week we were talking more about hygiene, and this week will be about sanitation. And these things are relevant to talk about because we're going to be going into another inspection season this summer for small businesses, and large businesses began last year. So this is just kind of to give a primer and prepare individuals for this upcoming inspection season. This also gives context to the series because we touched base on this more last week, but this is what FSMA inspections looked like in Idaho last year. And the big takeaways for this were that 45 total farms were inspected. And the biggest thing is that we did pretty well in inspections as a state with our large farms because the majority of farms did not have any observations, which an observation basically means that an inspector was on the property and then saw something that was in violation of the produce safety rule during the inspection. So that's really great. And then for those people who did have an observation, the other big takeaway was that they were able to correct those observations on site, which means that although that will be cited as an issue, that it was something that was able to be fixed while the inspector was there, which is really great. So some of the biggest areas of non-compliance were the sections of health and hygiene, equipment, tools, buildings, and sanitation, and records. So today we're going to be talking about the sanitation section, which was part of what those biggest issues that we had were. So this section basically is going to touch base on sanitation as the biggest factor, just because it is a very large section and we only have 45 minutes to get through it. So just keep in mind that we do have great resources that will outline the entire rule for you, but these are going to be the basic things that will affect sanitation on your farm and just things to be thinking about. So one of the first things, obviously, that the sanitation section talks about is cleaning and sanitizing on your farm. So basically what this means is that you have to have a process for cleaning and, when necessary, sanitizing all food contact surfaces of equipment and tools that are used for covered activities on the farm, meaning in the production of or harvesting, storing, packing of raw produce that is covered by the produce safety rule. So the next thing is that equipment and tools must be cleaned before they are sanitized. Sanitizing isn't always required every time. It's kind of something that's left up to your best judgment in terms of when something needs to be sanitized. But the important takeaway with this thing specifically, or this item specifically, is that you can't sanitize a dirty surface. So regardless of when you sanitize, it's always important that it is done after cleaning. That's something that we talk a lot about in our Produce Safety Alliance classes. So it's important to discuss that now as well. One thing we will talk about a lot today, or not a lot, but definitely have a couple slides on it, is picking or choosing a sanitizer and making sure that you're using it in accordance with the label guidelines, because that's a big thing we see a lot in on-farm readiness review, is that people, might have a sanitizing schedule and they might be sanitizing at the correct times, but unfortunately they're not using a sanitizer that is appropriate or safe for its intended use. So we'll talk about that. Another thing is the transportation of produce and thinking about vehicles as, or not just the vehicle, but the transportation process as a potential source for contamination. So basically the rule just talks about that you want to also be maintaining your vehicles for transportation to make sure that they're clean and also adequate for transportation. So meaning, if you use your Suburban or whatever and there's carpet on the bottom, that you're aware of that as a potential source of contamination because it's something that can't be cleaned. So are you putting a tarp on that, or how are you controlling for that as a potential factor and source of contamination? Next, if you use packing materials, you must use products that are adequate for their intended use, which means that they must either be single use or they must be cleanable and not something that's going to corrode if they are reusable. So, and then they also must be unlikely to support the growth or transfer of bacteria. The next section of this talks about, I kind of lumped these two together because that makes sense in terms of how you present the data or the information, but both the maintenance and storage of equipment. So they must be stored and maintained to protect covered produce from contamination. And then you must also maintain and clean all non-food contact surfaces as well. So that kind of extends beyond just making sure that things are sanitized, but also making sure that they're kept to an appropriate level of maintenance, I guess. So that these examples would be chipping paint, peeling tape, loose bolts, so things that can kind of break and fall off and become a harborage point or become a physical contaminant in produce as well. Another big thing that comes up in on-farm readiness review is that a lot of farms grow produce that is and is not covered by the produce safety rule, meaning stuff that is a raw commodity and one that, and others that are not. And so because of that, in transportation or with different equipment, they might go in between the two different types of commodities. And so the produce safety rule just basically says that equipment needs to be adequately cleaned and sanitized when switching, when appropriate sanitizing, when switching in between these two different types of commodities. And then it's ideal to designate equipment, but if that's not something that your resources will allow for, because it can be expensive to do that, just making sure that you're aware of that, keeping produce separate, except for when it's being transported, meaning that if it's all in the same car or the same tote or something like that, as long as they're in separate packaging, essentially. So the idea with this is that if you're treating all of your covered produce to the highest possible level of care, you don't want to just mix it in with produce that hasn't all been grown the same way, especially at the very end in transportation or after harvest, because then once it's all put together, that's going to be right before it is consumed, right before it goes to market. And that's when it's going to have the highest potential for contamination in terms of not being able to control for it after the fact. So that's essentially what that means. The next section is waste management. So basically just making sure that you're being cognizant of trash, picking it up when it's visible or present, making sure that you are staying on top of maintenance with trash cans on your facility and that they're present to begin with. So employees are throwing trash away, which is something we talked about quite a bit last week in hygiene. Waste management does have a lot of peripheral effects in terms of being able to be a source of contamination and then affect a lot of different areas of the farm, and there'd be different pathogen pathways once it becomes an issue. So that can be a really important thing. And then employee training, so training them on inspecting equipment and controlling or correcting for problems that may arise. So this would be, for example, harvest crates and making sure that if they're broken, they're being pulled out of rotation, or if a bird poops on them, do your employees know how to recognize that? Do you have an SOP that governs their, or not governs, but explains to them what they need to do in that circumstance? And then do they know what they need to be doing just to make sure that, they have their eyes on everything? That also is dropped covered produce. So things that are harvested and then dropped on the ground, and making sure they're not ending up in being harvested and then sold. And then lastly, not harvesting contamination. And this is something that kind of moves into a lot of different aspects in terms of what that means. But for example, that could be if there's animal intrusion and an animal being in the field, and then knowing that, if an animal does defecate in the field and then you remove it from the field, for example, that you're sanitizing the tools that have to do with that happening. So that's kind of how this becomes relevant in terms of sanitation with tools. And then pest management, so having a system in place for that. We're going to talk about that in a little bit more depth here in a couple minutes. And then also sanitation records, so the records that you have to keep for this section. And then this is our video series over here on the right-hand side, just in case you're wanting more background on this section specifically, because this isn't all the information that is in this section. It's just enough to basically give the webinar series and the little exercise that we're going to work through subsequently to this slide a little bit more context. So something that kind of occurs in thinking about the way that this applies to our operation is thinking about if we were to have an inspector out to our farm this year or next, or maybe you already had someone out last year, the kind of things that they may be looking for if they're on our farm. So relevant to sanitation, this is just an example of one thing that could occur. So for example, let's say your tools aren't being sanitized at the necessary intervals that they need to be sanitized at. So in terms of the rule, that would be related to section 1112, obviously, 112 or 123B2. Equipment and tools must be stored and maintained to protect covered produce from contamination. And then secondly, 123D1, you must maintain and clean food contact surfaces of tools. So this could look like, for example, if an inspector was out on your property and then they observe an employee take a tool of some kind and stab a drop piece of produce, maybe it fell off the packing line or out of a crate or who knows, but one way or the other ends up on the ground. And so they take a tool and just stab it because it's easier, and then kind of chuck it into the trash can from there. And then they go right back to whatever they were doing, still using the tool that they did that with. So this is something that's related to drop covered produce. And so the outcome for that would be that the drop produce has then come in contact with the ground and maybe has split open or, become contaminated in some way just by the nature of being on the ground and rolling around or, whatever may happen, and then coming in contact with the tool and then not cleaning that tool afterwards before putting it right back into production or going straight back to whatever you were doing. So essentially what the rule talks about with this is that it is your responsibility to protect produce from becoming contaminated. And so what that means is just being aware of the different sources of contamination and then not allowing those to become something that may affect your produce. So relevant to tools, they need to be cleaned and then when necessary sanitized if and when a potential contaminant is introduced. So for employees especially, that means being able to recognize what that means and knowing when cleaning and sanitation are required. So in this case, the employee did throw the produce away after it was dropped, which is what would be required under the rule, just making sure that it doesn't get into market essentially or get sold, like it needs to be destroyed essentially. But they didn't completely protect themselves from that potential source of contamination because they didn't follow all the way through with then sanitizing the product. So kind of de facto, they ended up still looping that contamination source back into being a problem. So there's one example. So in terms of picking a sanitizer, so let's say in that situation that employee did recognize, oh shoot, I just stabbed this off the ground or whatever, that they're going to have to go ahead and then sanitize that tool. So a problem with this can be, okay, I'm sanitizing at all the right times, my employees know when they need to be sanitizing, but then if you're sanitizing with the incorrect sanitizer or not using it in the way that it should be used or at the wrong concentration, then you might be creating more problems than you are creating solutions, I guess. So here are a couple of different steps with helping you figure out if you're using the right sanitizer and if not, how to do so. It can be a little bit tricky because there are a ton of products on the market, and most products that, like bleach, for example, are used for laundry, and so they might have a lot of different things in them that you don't necessarily want. So for this, we do refer to the Produce Safety Alliance spreadsheet, which I'll talk about here in just a second, that outlines what this looks like. But you can take your product and look for an EPA registration number on it, which will help you to identify the product and then if it will be safe for your intended use. And then you can also find information on usage based on that number. You only want to use products that are labeled for food contact surfaces or for use on fruits and vegetables. And then the recommended one that we talk about is basically just Clorox regular bleach, which is indicated on the label and also on the Produce Safety Alliance spreadsheet as being safe for fruit and vegetable use. So, and indicated by the EPA. So we'll write that. We'll talk about that in the next slide. And another thing is that you want to keep an eye out for things that are specialty grade or specialty bleaches, meaning that the manufacturer has added extra things to make them more effective in your laundry or more pleasant. So things that are scented or have stain removal enhancements or things like that, that obviously aren't things that we would want to be ingesting, or not ingesting, but have on surfaces that would then come in contact with produce and then be ingested after that. We don't want to ingest bleach at any interval. But so here's the Produce Safety Alliance spreadsheet related to sanitizers. So the way that you use this, and this is something that is in your handouts on your screen, and then I'll also link that if you're watching this as a recording onto our website. But it breaks down all the different sanitizers on the left-hand side under product name, and then kind of the alternate brand names here, the ones that are more recognizable to us, like regular bleach, as I was just talking about before. And then the really useful thing about this tool is it does break down the EPA registration number, which you'll be looking for on the bottle, the label, which has concentrations and usage and all of that indicated. And then the important thing here is that I've circled as well that it's labeled for use on food contact surfaces. So that's what you're going to be looking for, is things that won't become toxic when being used in your packing house or on tools and things that do act as a food contact surface. And this is something that we see a lot in on-farm readiness review as something that producers are doing incorrectly. So I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page on what a sanitizer is and how it should be used. So the next section related to this part of the rule is, for example, tools are being inappropriately stored. So this is related to section 1112B2. Equipment and tools must be stored and maintained to protect covered produce from contamination. So this could be an example of an inspector coming out and seeing hoses that are kind of just haphazardly all over the place and then being piled up. And for this example, we'll say that maybe one is piled up in a way that is affecting drainage in a packing house, for example. So an outcome of this would be that the tools are not being stored to protect from the potential spread of contamination. So there can become a harborage point for, little critters, or be collecting dirt, or they can be affecting runoff and drainage and all kinds of things, just dependent on where they're at, or also becoming a tripping hazard, or maybe some other kind of hazard if it's a sharp object being kind of just stored however. So the rule on this part of the section, or sorry, the rule on this part of the rule, I should say, is that you must store equipment and tools so they don't become another source of contamination or become something that can spread contamination. So things like we were talking about before with hoses or shovels or other equipment, you want to basically just be keeping this out of the dirt as best you can, or hung up and away from like traffic and dirt and water, because all of these different things, like being stepped on, or ants getting into them if it's a hose, or potentially water draining back into the hose, would just be harbored there and then can become just a greater risk and source of contamination. And then it is also best to have designated places for tools and to also make sure that they are on a cleaning schedule to ensure maintenance, meaning that if you have knives, all of the employee knives go in the same spot and that they're all being cleaned at a regular intervals, so that way you can keep that in check. A lot of places do have knives that are assigned to employees, and then they can keep them in their cubbies, and it can kind of become an issue because you don't know what is happening with those and if they are being cleaned or where they're being stored in between A and B. And so this last bullet point, which is kind of a catch-all as well, is just to say that if you're taking tools and storing them in places that well, really anywhere that you store them, if it comes in contact with other surfaces, then that surface that your tool comes in contact with then becomes also a food contact surface. Because if you have, let's say, a knife, for example, that is coming in contact with onions, and then you're storing that in some type of, let's say someone's wedging it in between a piece of metal and the conveyor belt on a packing line or kind of wherever, if they're pulling that out and then putting that in contact with produce and then putting it back into where they had it wedged, each time they do that, you're then going to have to try to become aware of what's wedged down in those little surfaces. And so it's really better to just not do that, or you have to just have a really good idea of what could be affecting that and how you're going to be sanitizing all the different things that it can come in contact with. Oh, I should say, again, like one last point on that, is that's why it's best to just have a designated place for those tools, somewhere that you're keeping it that isn't just haphazard and kind of wherever is conveniently wedged, because that's going to just keep opening you up for issues. So third would be that trash is not being adequately managed or disposed of. So this would be section 132. So you must provide appropriate disposal of trash to minimize the potential to attract pests and protect against contamination of covered produce. So an example of this would be an inspector if they were walking around and they see just trash everywhere, which we talked about this a little bit last week as well, but cans, water bottles, etc., just kind of all over the place. And this can become an issue because trash is a pathogenic hazard, especially when it's in places that cover produce. So the review on this would be that it becomes an issue with pathogens, as I just said, and then also drainage. And then another thing that's not really in the rule, but it can also become just a workplace hazard due to tripping if it were all in a packing house and, you know, people being in close quarters. And so the rule with this is to just not throw trash on the ground and try to instruct employees to do the same. Keep trash cans easily accessible, so that way it's not the more convenient option to just throw it on the ground and then just picking it up with whatever incidental trash may end up on the ground, because it does happen, but just making sure that you have, you know, a monitoring for that and just an awareness to make sure that it's not being placed there intentionally. And then this also includes like cold produce, trim, drop produce, and things that can just be thrown on the ground or end up on the ground or be dropped, and then making sure that you have a routine for maintaining that as well, just because it can become a harborage point for ants and an attractant for birds and mice, and so it just continually opens yourself up for risk. And then the last one would be just to make sure that you're emptying your trash can on a regular basis, because as we talked about last week, trash can just accumulate and accumulate, and then it's spilling over, and then it can get on employees' shoes and end up in the ditches and then get hit with wind and blow away. So I just want to make sure that we're staying on top of that as well. And then the last section would be pests, which is something that, you know, growers struggle a lot with, and then also have a lot of questions on non-farm readiness reviews related to the rule. So a couple of things that this could be related to is, let's say for this section, you have a fully enclosed building and no pest management. So this would be section 128. You must take measures necessary to protect covered produce, contact surfaces, packing material. Enclosed buildings must take measures to exclude pests. And then 126, you must implement measures to prevent contamination of your covered produce and food contact surfaces in your building as appropriate, considering the potential for such contamination through floors, walls, ceilings, fixtures, ducts, or pipes, drip or conduit. So for this could be an example of an inspector coming in and they witness a building that has dead animals, and then they see birds, then there's bird feces on the ground, and then upon asking the farmer about it, they realize that the building is used to store food contact surfaces like harvest crates and tools. So that becomes even greater of an issue versus, you know, something that was storing stuff that wasn't related to produce in general. So the outcome with this would be, first of all, dead birds and live birds, I guess, are both present. And then also they present pathogenic risks to food contact surfaces and produce. So in this situation, the operation has not established pest management or removed deceased birds. So both of these things are going to be massive issues. So the rule has a couple of different things to say about this. So first of all, you must take steps to deter pests and or exclude pests from fully enclosed buildings. So fully enclosed buildings, you have to, so fully enclosed buildings have different requirements than partially enclosed buildings do. So for fully enclosed, you must take measures to exclude pests completely from your building. So this would mean setting and monitoring traps ideally, or also creating an SOP to monitor them weekly or more, meaning that you may not need to monitor them as often, or maybe you have to monitor them way more often depending on how bad the issue can get. But the SOPs, which are standard operating procedures, basically just outline what the grower will be doing or what employees will be trained on doing for pest management and monitoring. And they should also detail the process to remove the pest from the property and then sanitize the issue, or not the issue, but sanitize where the issue occurred as well, just to make sure that it's not becoming a greater issue after the bird is removed, or in this case it was the bird, or after the mouse, or whatever animal may be a problem. And then for partially enclosed buildings, it's a little bit different, but you basically just have to make sure that they don't become established in your buildings. So that would be more like just monitoring or using screens, and then if you do see them, taking measures to do something after the fact versus making sure that they're not in there at all with a closed building, just because you may have one open wall or something like that where pests may be coming and going, and that's just part of agriculture and production and doing something that is in the outdoors, but just making sure that they're not creating nests or becoming an issue that will become a contaminant or be getting into produce in crates. So, and then here's some of the resources we talked about last week that I just wanted to break down. Again, so this is on-farm readiness review. It's a something that will help you guys we'll come out to the farm. It's usually myself from the University of Idaho Extension, and then a couple of individuals from the Idaho State Department of Agriculture, some inspectors, and we'll just come out to the farm and make sure that you guys understand in this section specifically, what sanitizer you're using, making sure that you're using the right one. We'll walk you through what your sanitation schedule looks like and make sure that you're cleaning and sanitizing the things that need to be sanitized. And then we'll also walk you through the rest of the rule, but just related to this webinar specifically. If you still have questions, you can reach out to me and or ISDA depending on what your question is. And then after the fact, I just want to make sure that everyone is aware that we do have more in-depth resources that are operation specific. And then in addition to that, if you have questions about the produce safety rule in general or FSMA in general, our website, which I broke down a little bit in the beginning of the webinar, is a really great resource. And then we also have training videos and templates for documentation and past webinar recordings and all kinds of different resources that are really great, which I broke down more last week. And then I'm going to turn this over to Colette for just a second.
Thank you, Lou. This is Colette D. Phelps, and I'm an area educator in community food systems located up in Moscow, Idaho. And if you have any questions, you could go ahead and type those into the Q&A box or into the chat. We haven't received any questions yet, Lou, so I'm just going to give it a little bit of time. And while we're waiting for that to happen, see if anybody has any questions. Do you want to just talk a little bit more about this series overall and what was on last week's webinar in case anyone missed that webinar?
Yeah, so this is a 3-part series that we created kind of to help growers understand inspections from last year and kind of the outcomes that we saw the most of, and then in terms of observations and stuff that we had as being out of compliance, and then B, how to understand the rule in general and in these specific areas that we tend to struggle with the most in terms of compliance. And so what we did is last week we broke down health and hygiene, so talking about the different sources of contamination potential in terms of employees on the farm and how to train them, and hand washing, and we kind of talked about how to hand wash, how to stock bathrooms, different places that you need to be thinking about that on the farm in terms of having access to the ability to wash your hands and to maintain our facilities. And then we had this webinar related to sanitation and some of the outcomes that could potentially happen in inspections. And then next week, we're going to be talking more specifically about record keeping, just because records is something that is relevant to so many different sections of the produce safety rules. So just making sure that we understand what a record is, what goes into that, how to keep one, and also the sections that require records. So after that, that will hopefully give us a better idea of where we're standing. And I've also been monitoring all the comments in terms of webinars that would be useful or questions and things that we're still missing in these webinars that we can be doing in our next section as well.
Great, thank you so much. We do have a question that came in. So Gretchen asked, can you please walk us through where to find the draft SOPs on the website?
So I don't know if we have draft SOPs on our website. Actually, I know that we don't. But we have templates, but not SOPs. Does she?
So draft record keeping templates is what you're saying?
Yeah, so we have that. I know that there are resources for SOPs that are provided, though. I don't know if Casey knows more about that, but I don't know where. We don't have them on our website specifically, though, but we do have a bunch of templates for all the different record keeping that is required in this section, but not SOPs. For example, if you wanted to have one on your farm for sanitizing something, or for after for checking traps, for pest management, or things like that that are relevant to the way that a farm wants to go about doing something. We don't have templates like that available on our website.
The
so Ariel,
PSA website has over 24 SOP templates that can be utilized.
The PSA website does?
Yeah.
Okay.
So Lou, could you make a link from the U of I Extension Commercial Produce Safety website to that portion of the PSA website to help people navigate and find those templates?
Yeah, and then I can also send that out in the follow-up email for that too.
Great, thank you. And thank you, Casey and Ariel, for sharing that information. I saw Ariel had posted it in the chat as well. We don't have any other questions that have come in this morning. So Lou, thanks for that great presentation and providing all those resources in terms of the handouts and making sure that they are available on the website. That was really thorough, and it's really helpful to have the different examples of some of the observations that you have seen and how those observations relate to the rule. Oh, we just did have a question that came in while I was talking, so I will ask you to answer this final question. It says, in a fruit stand displaying product to be sold, how often should they be sanitized, and the crates where the products are coming from on the field? So how often should sanitization happen of crates that are used in the field for transporting, harvesting and transporting products? And then how often should display materials, for instance, crates or surfaces, be sanitized?
Casey, do you want to answer that question?
The rule states as reasonably necessary when it comes to sanitizing. So if you were to be in a situation where you're visibly starting to see buildup in residue or organic material in your crates, you should be cleaning those. And then if there's still a reason of concern for risk that there might have been a dead animal or feces in there, then you would want to follow up with some sort of sanitation process to ensure that you're reducing or you're mitigating your risk to contaminating your produce. In terms of containers, you can utilize single-use containers, or you can even input some sort of packaging material in there that could be single-use, or you can use reused material, but it has to be cleaned and sanitized in between use.
Okay, thank you. Lou or Ariel, do you have anything that you'd like to add?
No, I don't. I think that was a good answer.
Okay, great, thank you. Well, those are all our questions, so I'll hand it back to you, Lou, to wrap up this webinar.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you for participating, everybody that gave us questions and also those who answered them. Oh, shoot. There we go. Okay, so I just wanted to do a quick recap on our series just to make sure that everyone is aware that we do have one more in the April series coming up next week. So as I said just a couple of minutes ago, this one will be focusing on record keeping in terms of, first of all, what does it mean to keep a record? What does the rule define a record as? What records are required? And we'll just talk about the different sections of the rule that pertain to records. So that'll be another hour long. This one ended a little bit shorter than an hour, but I think that one has quite a bit of information, so it'll be a little bit longer of a webinar. And then a couple of our staff are down below, and myself being Lou Huger again, Ariel Agenbrod in Ada County. We have Colette Phelps from the University of Idaho as well, Moscow up north, and then Casey Mon at Idaho State Department of Agriculture. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us, with really anything that has to do with produce safety rule, and we'll be sure to get back to you. Otherwise, we'll see you next week. And I also want to let everybody know that the recordings of these webinars, if you want to watch them again or want to refer them to someone else, will all be on our website, which I provided you a link for in the handout section. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you next week.